Hello and welcome to a second video in a series on ancient economies and how they compare to the economy that we possess in the Western developed world today. Very long and wordy title. I'm sure I'll come up with something better for the video itself. Today we're talking about the classical Roman economy. Now, there are a couple of things I have to preface this with. First, while I am a historian, this is going to be very much not an in-depth, detailed and academic breakdown of every development of the Roman economy during the pre-Punic War period. That's because I'm making this for YouTube and not writing an academic paper. If you would like to know more, I will link some sources down below which you could pursue instead. I am going to give a brief overview of the history of the Republic of Rome up to the point that I'm talking about, and I'm going to note the events which shifted the economy of Rome away from the state that I'm addressing today. For more detail, I would highly recommend Mike Duncan's wonderful podcast, The History of Rome, as it is a just brilliant overview of Rome's history all the way from its legendary founding up until the generally accepted fall of the Western Roman Empire in the mid-5th century AD. Now, key events that led up to the Rome as we know it at about the time that I'm talking about, which is just before the First Punic War. So this is around the 270s BC. Rome is founded as we know it in its republican form in legendarily 753 BC. You have the story of Romulus and Remus raised by a she-wolf until Romulus kills Remus, several accounts of how that occurs, and names the city he founds on 7 hilltops next to the Tiber after himself, Rome. This is how the Romans themselves dated the time in their era after the founding of the city, and it's what we tend to use. It's a wonderful story, and it doesn't make a huge amount of difference whether it's wrong. After that, you have several kings of Rome until the last, Tarquinius Superbus, is overthrown. Now, he is a tyrant. That is, someone who uses their power absolutely, cruelly and harshly and disregards the will of the people that they govern and rule. Now, the Romans were not against concentrating power. They had an office called dictator, which they would award to individuals in times of crisis, because they recognized that when you have severe threats to the security of a nation, to the stability of a nation, getting things done is more important than process. So in order to get things done in a time of crisis, such as barbarian invasion, they would appoint a dictator. However, that dictator would step down. You may think it's strange today to have somebody who's been given absolute power relinquish that power, especially when we look at Rome in its later periods. But this was done many times, that you would have dictators come to power, fulfill whatever mission they'd been set out to fulfill, and then be done with things. Definitely in our period, this is what occurred. The Romans were, ever after the fall of the Tarquins and the beginning of the Republic, very much anti-monarchist. They were staunchly against the idea of kings as a long-term governing system. They instead elected a wide variety of official bodies who would carry out the powers required to run the state effectively. They had a large variety of these bodies, as I say, and I won't go into all of them today because that would take us quite a while. But suffice to say that there was a sort of top body, if you like, the Senate, which was made up of the rich, aristocratic, we might think of them in the medieval period as lords, but in this period they're just large landowners who handle most of Rome's sort of foreign policy, if you like. Then you have several assemblies of the people. So this is of all stratas excluding slaves, And they actually handle an awful lot of legislation and have veto power through their elected officials, the tribunes, against anything the Senate does. So there's a constant tension within the system that doesn't get resolved until after our period. Now, fast forwarding from the legendary founding, many exploits in early Rome, but we get to a formative moment, which is the first sack of Rome in 387 BC. So a bunch of Gauls, led by a warlord called Brennus, come down, bash through the Roman army as it exists at the time, and sack Rome. Now, this is a permanently scarring moment on the Roman psyche. It forever leaves them antagonistic, fearful, vengeful, desiring against the Gauls. There are Gauls on both sides of the Alps, by the way, at this period. There are Gauls in northern Italy, and there are Gauls in what is today France. But this really galvanizes the Romans, if you like, and sets them off on their path that eventually leads them to the domination of most of the Italian peninsula. The bookend of our period, that I've arbitrarily decided today, no, for good reason I've decided, is the First Punic War, which starts in about 264 BC. The reason I bookended our period with that is that by the time the First Punic War finishes, Rome has really begun to range outside of Italy and, crucially, has started exploring naval power, has gained a foothold on the seas, ships, maritime trade under Roman control. Up to this period, Roman traders really don't travel the seas very much, and Rome doesn't have a navy. Most trade is done by various Phoenician-descended groups and some Greek traders. So the Phoenician-descended groups, the most powerful of which is Carthage, they do an awful lot of maritime trade, and they have naval warships that keep piracy to a not dangerous level. It still exists, but it's not too hazardous to shipping. The reason this is very important is that Rome's economy shifts a lot once you start really getting into the business of overseas trade in a centralized way, in a state-supported way. Why is that? Well, let's look at the Roman economy in the period that I am talking about. So this is 270s, 280s BC. We are looking at a Roman republic, and we are looking at one with the main difference between their economy and our economy today being a lack of an income tax. Now, income tax, as we think of it today, is a usually staggered progressive system where you tax the income, the raw money earned by people from work. So giving of labor in some form, you receive money from that, the form of wages, which are taxed as income. Now, in our modern system, there are an awful lot of small rules about what counts as income, what doesn't. But the main thing to recognize about an income tax is it is meant to tax those who have very little money less, and then have higher rates of taxation the more money you have. So that the more you earn, the more you pay in tax, the larger share of it, and of course the greater nominal amount. But crucially, because you are earning more, you still take home, after tax, more than people who earn less than you, even though they're being taxed at a lower rate. The reason to do this is that it promotes equality in society. It takes money from those who have the most to give directly, and it then allows the government, the state, doing the taxation to spend money on works which will improve the material lives of all of its citizens, regardless of how much they themselves earn. The reason this is most important is that people's income is strongly dictated by the income of the family that they are born and raised in, and while it is possible for people to elevate above their station, it is exceptionally difficult, and it is far, far easier and simpler for those who have wealth to remain wealthy and to increase that wealth further. There is a problem with an income tax. The biggest problem is that it doesn't target people who don't earn their wealth through conventional income. So if you earn wealth through share dividends, if you earn wealth through the trading of shares, if you earn wealth through rents paid on properties that you own, if you earn interest on mortgages that you have lent out, these things are, with some exceptions depending on the country, not classed under income. A couple of reasons behind this. The most prominent one is that the people who are able to fund political parties who then get elected are generally very wealthy themselves. Further, those who control the media in society, who dictate in large part the voting patterns of people who are not themselves very politically invested, are also owned by very wealthy individuals. And there is a pervasive societal perception that wealth is virtuous, that if you have a lot of wealth, that is good, and you are thusly a good person. Further, there is the idea that to be successful in life is to make it, to become rich. So there is an emphasis on money and wealth as something which is good and which people should aspire to have, and that achieving that wealth is in some way innately good. This is not really how Republican Rome worked. They had very different societal views on what was good, what was virtuous, and what success meant. And really, modern society is very odd, historically, in terms of what it sees as success. What did the Romans think? That's what we're here for. Well, the most important thing to the Roman mind was honor, was legacy, was military accomplishments, was building things with your name slapped to them, which would last for years. Basically, the measure of success was attaining high political office and leaving monuments by which you would be remembered. And by monuments, sometimes I mean big statues of yourself that serve little practical purpose, but other times, roads, aqueducts, huge infrastructure projects which materially improved the lives of many less wealthy individuals. The Roman Republic has this idea of honor and duty and high political office, and very strongly emphasizes this sort of family lineage. And this doesn't have to be blood relation. Adoption into families is rife. It happens everywhere in Rome. So it's not about the blood. It's about the name that you have, however you came to acquire it. So all of the senators in that highest body that I talked about earlier, they have this large amount of power by virtue of their wealth and their position. If you want to be a consul, two of which are elected every year and who are the equivalent of a prime minister today, but with much more power. They are more powerful than a president of the US today. They're very strong elected individuals. The check on their power is not that they themselves have many limits, but is that they have such a short term and that you can't be consecutively elected. Almost every political office in Rome has what you might think of as a cooling off period before you're allowed to be elected to it again. Now, in Rome, how does this concentration of wealth and power to a small handful of people at the top of society affect their economy? Well, they don't have an income tax. The main reason for that, I would posit, is that there's just a lot of complication. There's a lot of complexity in assessing everybody's income and bringing in a tax like that. The Roman state doesn't have as many government expenditures as ours do today. Think of something like the fire service, we think of something like education. All of these are not government services in Rome. Education is something that is done privately. So everywhere is a private school that you're able to go and get educated at. Most Romans are homeschooled, insofar as there is schooling at all. Like most Romans are farmers, and you grow up and learn to farm, or you move to the city and start a trade. There isn't a systematic education system that we'd recognize today, except for the very wealthy. And this means that the government doesn't require as much revenue as it has today. However, there's a lot of things that a modern government does that still need to be done. They're just mostly done by individual senators, individual wealthy landowners. They accrue their wealth through rents, primarily, and through the sale of agricultural goods and produce. So this isn't to say that by there not being an income tax, the ordinary person in Rome didn't have to, give their money to people. It's just they were giving their money in the form of rents, primarily, and often in the form of labor, rather than direct money. So because wealth came primarily from land ownership, and it came from mines, and it came from agriculture, this meant that if you owned those things, you were able to become wealthy. It also came from housing. So an awful lot of senators would own blocks of flats in Rome and housing throughout the Roman world, which their tenants would then pay rents to use. And of course, they are selling the food that's produced on their farms back to those tenants, so they're making money through that as well. There was also a lot of money which came in through conquest and raiding and war, which would be deposited in the state treasury and then used to pay for things like raising an army, to pay for things like building the navy when you get to the Punic Wars, to pay for things like setting up colonies in conquered areas. Because you have this large system of landowning, you might imagine that there were very few individual citizen farmers, if you like. But this wasn't the case. Later in the Roman Republic period, we do see an awful lot of tension come to be, because a huge swathe of Roman agricultural land is owned by a very small number of elites. But pre-Punic War period, we actually have a large variety of sizes of land owned. There's a lot of citizen farming, and it is these citizen farmers who are primarily being called up to serve in the army in times of war. The professionalization of the Roman military is another factor which really leads to this economic system having to change drastically. So really long wars, like the First Punic War, like the wars of Marius and Sulla later on, these lead to the army stopping its character of being a citizen force raised for war, and then everybody goes back home to their fields, and starts becoming a professional gig where you get paid day in, day out, and at the end of service are rewarded with some land to sort of settle down on, if you like. Now, I think a fascinating thing to look at is the system of tribute, basically between the Romans and other Latin states. So Rome came to dominate the whole of the Italian peninsula later on, but it starts off just as the city and extends outwards through the province of Latium, which is where we get the word Latin, the language of the church in later periods. Now, the Roman Republic controls a lot of the Italian peninsula, but it does so through a series of treaties and agreements with other city-states and polities within that area. And each of these has agreements whereby those polities will provide things to Rome, usually vast majority of cases, it is troops rather than directly money. We should also talk about the form that money takes in this period. It becomes coinage, yes. But the first coins in the Italian peninsula don't really appear until about 325 in Naples. And it isn't until a couple of decades later they start becoming widespread in Rome itself. This isn't to say that people didn't use metal to trade before that. They would just normally trade in terms of weights and measures rather than distinct coins. So you can find record of so many £1,000 of silver being deposited into the Roman state treasury rather than saying so many sestetes or denarii, which are later Roman coins. They're still using the wealth. They're still using the metal as a measure of wealth. They're just not trading with coins. They're trading with weights. So you can think of it as sort of a system in between what you might imagine of a barter economy, but before you get to currency as we would understand it, stuff that is made specifically for the purpose of being a trade medium. Other things that the Roman economy made money through, apart from this system of rents, there were customs duties for goods coming in and out of Rome. There were fees on trading goods, kind of similar to a goods and services tax as we'd understand today. There were monopoly sales. So this doesn't happen so much today. But you used to be able to, in the Roman world and even through much of the medieval period, buy a corporate monopoly on a particular trade good. So in Britain and Flanders, in the 12 and 1300s, you're buying wool monopolies. In Rome, you might be buying salt monopolies. So you being the family, usually in this case, that is permitted to trade salt. What this does is generate a lot of revenue for the government, and then leave a single company to exploit the hell out of its salt monopoly for as long as you like. One analog would be something like a patent today, but really this is what modern antitrust laws are there to prevent happening, so we don't formally sell monopolies today. What about regulation? The Romans did have the capacity to recognize when things were financially wrong. They did institute several different bodies over the course of their existence to address financial irregularities and problems. When there was a debt crisis in the sort of mid-4th century, you get these officials called the mensarii, who get formed and appointed, a 5-man panel to try and deal with private debt crisis. And the way they go about this is directly purchasing private debt with public funds. And there are a lot of calls throughout Roman Republican history for debt relief, for land reform. These come up all the time, and they are the main source of tension between the power of the People's Assemblies and the power of the Senate. Right, what else is there to talk about the Roman economy? Philanthropy. It's the main course from that first episode we wanted to address. So when we think of philanthropy today, it's usually in the context of these privately owned, huge charitable sort of funds which provide a vehicle for wealthy individuals to launder their money. Spend their money on projects that they deem worthy. Because these are charitable organizations being run by and donated to by billionaires primarily, they tend to have those billionaires' interests and incentives at heart when they do their work, which isn't great because the societal framework and the economic system which permits the concentration of wealth to such an extent that there is this cadre of billionaires at the top who are sort of hoovering up all of the money and then not leaving enough for the rest of the world to be able to, sort itself out, is not one that you want to preserve, I would argue. And you're permitting those billionaires to be the ones who decide where a small portion of their money, which they then get to write off as tax deductible, is spent. That's not a system which is ever going to produce lasting change, because the people doing the apportioning of money are the ones who stand to gain by not instituting effective change that would better people's lives. In the Roman world, there is a small element of this, which is to say that wealth is concentrated in large part to a small elite at the top. But because they have different societal conceptions, and because the government does less, it is incumbent upon those wealthy individuals to provide public infrastructure and to provide for things that a government would normally do. Another thing that's important to note is that for a Roman person, especially one of high standing, political office is what gives you honor and fame and is success. Political office, military office. Political office is military office in this period, but political office and military success. That is the measure of a man in this time. So the wealthy are the ones who are pushing to be elected and the ones who are having to tangibly affect people's lives positively in order to garner the votes required. So how does this differ from today? Two main reasons. One, the government is meant to do a lot more today. Kind of a holdover from a period when we taxed the rich more and were able to afford more public service, is the government is expected to provide a lot more than the Roman state was expected to provide. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of welfare, social care, all of these things are sort of baked into the modern Western style of government, and they're being stripped away by newly elected officials. And that's because those officials are being elected by the wealthy for the interests of the wealthy. And they can make a lot more money if they are the ones who are fulfilling all these essential government services, as they did in the Roman period. The other main difference is that today, the wealthiest people are not usually the ones who are actually getting elected. Billionaires are bankrolling politicians. Often those politicians are multimillionaires, but they're not the ones who hold sort of the true wealth. They hold a good portion of wealth, more than you or I will ever see, but they're not the super rich. The super rich are bankrolling politicians. This gives them this disconnect, this distance, this reach and influence in a way that requires explanation to people. It is not self-evident that the most wealthy have the most power. It's required that you sort of explain this to people. That is, in and of itself, a huge benefit to the super rich, because it is so much harder to explain things to a large group of people, to educate a broad swathe of people, than it is to throw some buzzwords at them, pay for some TV ads, and promote a polarization of discussion. If you tell people there is an easy path, and that easy path still leads to you being happy and prosperous and not having to think about difficult questions, most people will take that path, which is really difficult to combat, but worth trying to do, I think. Which is why I'm making videos like this. The important thing to note about this difference between Roman society and modern society is that because the wealthiest in society were directly being elected to these political positions, they were enormously more immediately accountable to the citizens of Rome, because it was synonymous to say that if a big infrastructure project wasn't being built, it was because the senators or the consuls of that era were not fulfilling their sort of, duties and obligations to the people of Rome. And there were tribunes of the plebs and many other elected officials of those people's assemblies who had power, who were able to go out there and just speak to the masses and get this message through to people. So you had an awful lot more direct accountability for the ultra wealthy, for what they were doing with that money, and an explicit duty for them to use it in the service of Rome and her people. Does this mean that they always, used it in that best way? Well, of course not. Humans are human. That's the wonderful thing at the heart of society, is that it is an elaborate mess that we maintain with common agreement and cause. And when we lose that common, agreement, that social compact, society breaks down for a bit and needs to be reformed, and often splits up, and needs to be reunified later. We're kind of in a period of social, I'm not going to say reform yet, because I don't see really a whole lot of solutions being put forward. But we're certainly in a period of social breakup, social fracturing, polarization, and the precursor to reform. So it's worth learning both about how the current system works and how other systems used to work. Now, the next video in this series will probably cover some bits of the Roman Republican story that I missed, and talk briefly about later Republican Rome, what changed in the Punic Wars, and really about how the militarization of the army shifted the way that the Roman economy worked. But the next big topic we'll cover is actually about army formation and militarization and professionalization during the 30 Years' War. So we'll jump forwards nearly 2,000 years to talk about the formation of modern armies and militaries, which take up so much budget of countries today, what the system looked like before they were brought in. It wasn't just noble levies, mercenaries played a huge role, and why some modern conflicts are revisiting those old ideas. And of course, how this ties into modern economic challenges.